Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Humanities Kansas Big Idea Presentation. I'm Freddy Gipp, enrolled member of the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma, Digital Program Manager for Humanities Kansas, and your co-host along with Dr. Valerie Mendoza, Director of the Title III Strengthening Institutions Grant at Washburn University. The Big Idea, which is a monthly online series that highlights fresh thinking on humanities topics through brief essays and online interviews. Last season highlighted Black scholars, emphasizing past and present work and how it has impacted their careers and communities. And for this season, we are transitioning our focus to elevate and explore Indigenous scholarship in Kansas. Today's Big Idea presentation, titled Natives Making News Toward a More Authentic and Ethical Representation of American Indian Identity, Issues, and Individuals, focuses on how we can better examine a clear and more accurate way of true journalistic approach and what must be done. Joining us today is Dr. Melissa Greene-Blye of the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma, who is an assistant professor in the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Kansas. Dr. Greene-Blye worked as an anchor and reporter during her 20 years in news business, covering local news and television markets big and small. Her research examines journalistic representations and negotiations of American Indian identity, past and present. Dr. Greene-Blye, it's good to see you. How's everything going?
It's good. A busy semester we were just talking about. I think everybody's feeling the squeeze. But we're near the end. So thank you so much for letting me join you today.
Yeah, definitely. And so before we begin, the format of discussion is very simple, as Dr. Mendoza and I will alternate on questions relating to your essay, career, and other relatable topics in today's Big Idea. And towards the end of the program, we will allow those in the audience to ask questions through the webinar's Q&A and chat feature. Dr. Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Freddie. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So could you talk a little bit more about how you got into journalism and the training that you received? Because part of your essay is sort of calling for a new or an expanded, maybe that's a better word, training for journalists and how they work.
Sure. No, absolutely. I settled on journalism young. I somewhere around 8th grade, it just clicked. Funny now in my positioning as a native scholar and a media historian, because some of the and it was men early in journalism that inspired me to pursue the field are some of the journalists and editors I take to task now in my research because of their misrepresentations of Native peoples. But so knowing that, right out of high school, I attended journalism school at Indiana University. I was actually a double major there in telecommunications and political science. And, the process is usually going out doing internships and just gaining that experience in newsrooms, which is so important to sort of learn the process and structure of how news is found, how news is packaged and presented. I did a master's at Missouri after I'd been out in the business for a little while, and then I went back to the business. So I kind of joke that, big and small, I've done them all. And I a little bit did career in reverse, because as an undergrad, I very ambitiously just chose to call CNN one day to ask for an internship. I don't know, by some stroke of magic, connected with an IU alum and ended up at CNN and was hired. So I started at the network, and then because I wanted to be a reporter, they said, you really need to go back to, local smaller markets and start building and working your way up. And that's what I did. So it's a great way to make a living. You just something different every day. And I think that's what's great about it. But you also learn that there are some formulaic components to the limitations of the news cycle. And that's a little bit of what needs to be addressed to improve representation for voices that are marginalized or silenced.
Yeah. Your essay it's so rich. So that I could talk about stuff all day, but let me go back to what you just said about the limitations of the news cycle, because that has certainly, expanded over the last, couple of decades. So more and more news, but it also seems to be more and more of the same thing, just over and over again.
Well, and so that is, I think, one of the concerns is the news whole, right? The outlets, the opportunities, the amount of news content has grown astronomically since the time of, three big networks that went on the air at 6 p.m. and, in theory, all of America sat and watched these, choice of two or three anchors presenting the news of the day. And then they are choosing what stories fit into their 30-minute window. But what hasn't necessarily happened is more diverse representation and improved representation across those larger news holes and platforms. And in this moment, while it's fantastic that we see things like podcasting taking off, streaming opens up so many opportunities where not everybody is fighting for that same limited air. It also allows potentially a greater degree of compartmentalization where we don't have to engage with voices that differ from ours or opinions that differ from ours. Research tells us we tend to seek out or hear information in a way that reinforces our existing beliefs. So if we have a way to avoid encountering differing perspectives, we never have to question or learn or grow.
Right. Yeah. And that's a big issue. And you kind of go into that in your essay when you talk about this case from 2016 regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act and a family in San Francisco who wanted to adopt a native child. Can you explain that issue for those of us who didn't get to read your essay and just kind of talk about how the media portrayed
Sure. Yeah, this is a case that's off-cited to show and demonstrate the difference in coverage of a single story between a native news outlet and a non-native news outlet. And it was in 2016. It was a case involving, I believe, then a 4-year-old Choctaw girl, and she'd been placed with a white foster family. And the story ultimately made national news, but a big contrast in coverage, again, based on who was telling that story. So one example of that is the ABC affiliate in San Francisco, and of course there you have these powerful visual images and video of what's happening in this moment, but they headlined coverage, Indian Child Welfare Act separates foster daughter from Santa Clarita family. And then the story that was on their website reads, in photos, they're a happy family, but Sunday could be the worst day for the lives of Rusty and Summer Page and their foster daughter, Lexi. The story goes on to note that Lexi is 1.5% Choctaw, which there are issues around that sort of identification of native blood quantum. But it says because of that, her case fell under the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was a federal law passed in the 70s that aims to protect the best interests of Native American children and promote stability of tribal families. So while they recognize what the act is supposed to do, they show these visuals of this child essentially being torn from her family and how devastated this family is. Well, that same week, Indians.com ran a story headlined, Anti-Indian Child Welfare Act attorney takes on another dispute. That article offers a much more detailed explanation of the facts of the case. And we learned that this case has been ongoing for 2 years and that the foster family knew that from the time that Alexandria P., which is the child they've called Lexi, came into their care, that her father had been pursuing his parental rights for several years. So they weren't just blindsided by the fact that she was going to be removed from their home. They had always known that was a possibility. But what we see in this moment on the ABC affiliate is just the gut-wrenching loss of this non-native family, but we don't even hear from her Native family and from her father, or even understand that context. And it's that kind of thing that makes it problematic, because are those powerful visuals? They absolutely are. But do they tell us the whole story? They don't. And they don't really go on to explain well and in depth why ICW exists to begin with. And if you're going to do that story and yet fail to acknowledge the historical context of Native children being taken out of their homes and sent to boarding schools and residential schools and forced to give up their own culture and identity, you're not really getting a complete picture.
Definitely. And this fits into my question, which is how important is it for tribal organizations to have their own forms of representation when conducting work in the field?
So media representation?
Yeah, like representation, anything, just
Oh,
like having like an office of the press, like a press secretary and stuff. Like
yeah.
how vital is that, and how vital, like especially with Indians.com, bringing that contrasting perspective, that's tribally represented, you know what I mean, from different focuses. So what do you think in that perspective?
I think it's huge. I mean, and there are some, fantastic outlets out there right now, Indian Country Today, Native News Online, Indians.com. And then you have, a multitude of tribal media outlets, radio, podcasting, no longer quote newspapers, right? But digital platforms. I think it's absolutely important. And a lot of times those specific tribal media are focused most on educating their immediate community. But I think it's a great idea, and it's something I think we would benefit from more if individual nations chose to have an appointed press liaison or point of contact. Unfortunately, so often what happens is when media come knocking in Indian country, it's over a problem, an issue, or what they perceive to be a problem or issue. And then many nations are left sort of reacting to that versus being proactive. So that's a really strong thought for consideration. And of course, NAJA, the Native American Journalists Association, is a phenomenal resource for Native journalists and for people who are looking for stronger representation. And they're also always willing to jump in and advocate in situations involving coverage of tribal nations, individuals, et cetera. But having a voice in their own story is huge.
Yeah. So that kind of brings up two issues for me as you're talking. The first is that in your essay, you discussed the importance of using non-traditional sources, or in the example you gave us about the Indian Child Welfare Act, using Native sources at all, right? Especially, when reporting on Native issues. So what are some non-traditional news sources that you think would be important to, especially teach, since you're, at KU and teaching there? And why are they important when reporting on Native news stories?
Yeah, it is kind of at its most basic level a problem of sourcing. So often what we see happening is that journalism and coverage ends up talking about Native people and fails to be in conversation with them. It's really thinking about knowing that there are organizations like NAJA out there that, if you go to their website, have a multitude of resources speaking to, for example, the Indian Child Welfare Act, what it is, why it matters, how to cover it, speaking to issues of terminology. Beyond NAJA, it's knowing who to talk to when you are attempting to cover an issue within a tribal community. And understanding how to really vet those sources, just like you do in any other story. And unfortunately, too often what happens is there's a little bit of an intimidation factor there, I think, for non-Native journalists, because to be fair, there's a lot of suspicion from tribal communities when it comes to press coverage, because for far too long, there's just been too much misrepresentation. So sometimes they'll take the first easiest source or person who will talk to them, and they don't bother to find out if that individual is actually the person who should be speaking for that community. It's taking the time to learn and examine what the governmental structure is for that community, to understand who should be talking about that issue. I remember being on a panel with a Native journalist, and she was like, come to a basketball game. You don't ever come into our community until you're there to cover a problem. And then you wonder why no one wants to talk to you. So it's about building relationships in those communities. And it's also understanding that there's a lot more going on in Native communities than these stereotypical problems that so often get shown or talked about in the news. Again, it's resources, it's understanding government, and it's taking time to also recognize that there's not so much a Native American culture, that each tribe, nation has its own unique experiences, beliefs, and culture. And taking the time to learn about that before you just parachute in and start pointing your camera or asking for interviews.
Yeah, so with examining non-traditional sources and looking at that specifically, I've seen that firsthand with like the coverage around Haskell. That has been really lackadaisical, especially in the local media. I remember Perspective, there was an article that came out about a bar fire downtown. Simultaneously, the teepee caught on fire, but it was well beforehand. But then, yet the only thing that caught the news attention was the downtown was on fire. So little discrepancies like that is kind of weird, and if and most of what we've noticed in our community is that if there's only press about Haskell, it's not really good press. And that's just unfortunate, just with the way that the administration's been going and stuff. So that's what we've kind of noticed from that perspective. And that's not even a tribal organization. That's a federally run institution that's managed by Native Americans. So, it makes you ask, what is the problem? So going into that, like, what are some of the key areas that will be essential for news and information in Indian country in the future? Like, what are you thinking in your career? Like, what's the trajectory in which we're going to start focusing on?
Wow. I think there's a lot of room for growth, for sure. And, one thing that has to be addressed as we look to grow opportunities for Native media outlets, opportunities for Native journalists, is the economics of it, right? We know too often that tribal media outlets struggle financially. Some of them do have financial support from their nations. That also sometimes introduces issues of control and censorship. So I think those two issues have to be addressed. So it's looking for new funding opportunities and sources to fund Native voices. I think it's also access to training and really bringing up a next generation of young journalists who are given access to the education to be a journalist, having access to the resources and the technology to do podcasting, to go out and shoot videos for news stories, access to laptops to be a digital journalist. These days, we can, if we have to, right, produce an entire news story right on our phone. And it's a little bit about teaching those skills and the values of good journalism, and then letting them go back to their communities and start to tell the stories out of their communities. And then it's about finding the outlets for that. So it's finding the financial support and a platform to offer a venue for that content. So I don't know if you want me to get into specifics now, but part of that is one thing we're doing at KU is launching a summer workshop for Indigenous high school students, where they can come and spend not quite a week, 4 to 5 days, learning podcasting, learning how to go out and turn a news story with video, and how to edit and tell that story and present that story. Another idea is we're hoping to launch is a student news program. And I really see that as news and information, because I think when we're talking about coverage in Indian country and we say journalism, it carries a heavy weight. I really like the idea of saying we're teaching storytelling skills because we're storytellers.
Yeah.
And I think that's much more appealing because we do have news that we need to share, but we also have a lot of stories that we want to share. And I think it's striking that balance. And I don't know if you want to discuss the initiative we're working on together.
It can be after.
Okay. But I think a lot of it is access to training and to the infrastructure needed to evolve those platforms. It's great that we see Native journalists starting to be hired into non-Native newsrooms, but I think we also have to make sure they don't get lost in the shuffle. And that raises the whole issue of pigeonholing Native journalists.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that makes me think, what was your experience as a Native person working in non-Native newsrooms?
Yeah, it's interesting. And geography makes such a huge difference in whether there is any coverage or not. So in the markets I worked in, Indianapolis was kind of one of my hometown big market. So there wasn't a lot of coverage. The Miami Nation has presence in Indiana because we were there before removal, and occasionally there would be coverage of the Miami Nation there, but that was always centered around petitions for federal recognition, and it was always couched in federal policy, and the voices were always the Indiana lawmakers who were going to make or break this petition. So it was always couched in that perspective and not from our perspective. When I worked in the Southeast, you might occasionally find coverage centered around stories related to the Cherokee Nation, but more often than not, it was the commemoratives of the Trail of Tears. It wasn't so much about what that nation is doing today and its presence today. I did get to go cover the opening of their casino in Cherokee, North Carolina. But again, that was couched in how that was going to affect the larger economy and not so much about what it meant for the community itself. Other issues I encounter are issues of expectations of Native identity. So when I was on the job market, I have often encountered moments where I have had to prove my identity. And I do remember I applied for a position in the Southwest in a market, and the news director called me, and I was really excited because that's usually a good sign. And he said, "I really like your reel," which is, you know, the demonstration of my on-air work. He said, "But I can't put you on the air out here because," and he literally said, "the Indians would go crazy." And I was like, wow. And that was just back in a day and time where he felt free to say that. And I said, well, I appreciate the honesty. And I guess that tells me, you know, that's not where I need to be anyway. But he didn't really understand why I took issue with that. So, you know, historically, there are all kinds of issues around expected Indians in our nation's journalism. And when we fail, I guess, to fit those expected parameters, which essentially fall prey to stereotypes, we're not as good of a story.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking before the webinar started about how in your essay you talk about how Native stories don't make the mainstream press, right, until they affect the dominant society, right? And so I was mentioning to Dr. Greene-Blye that I went on Indians.com to look that up because she had mentioned that site in her essay and I wasn't familiar with it. And I'm on that site and I noticed that there was a White House Tribal Nations Summit this week. And I had no idea because no other news outlet that I looked at had mentioned anything about it. So what stories are we not hearing right now that we should know about, past or present? Because you know you're a historian of the media.
Yeah, well, and so, yeah, and it's ongoing problems. It's, again, Naja does a media spotlight report where they evaluate where we're seeing or not seeing Native voices. And in their 2020 report, they analyzed news coverage at 5 national news outlets in the United States. And they basically concluded that there were a lot of stories that included placing people in the past, very official heavy interviews, meaning federal or governmental versus tribal, in talking about the impacted communities that were the focus of the stories. And they said, sadly, there were not a lot of Indigenous journalists reporting on Indigenous issues within their sample. And, they support the idea that had there been more Indigenous authors, the stories might then also have been more inclusive of community sourcing. And so unfortunately, what happens too often is the stories that do make major news or capture national headlines aren't news to the communities being covered. A lot of times they're issues and challenges that have been ongoing for years, if not generations. So when a Native-centric story makes national headlines, it's typically because it fits into the larger non-Native narrative. And that, again, continues to perpetuate stereotypes and stereotypical coverage. And it also then perpetuates the distrust of outsiders coming in to cover those communities. One really good example of that is old enough now that there's been an opportunity to do some research around it and draw some conclusions was the Dakota Access Pipeline. That was also happening in 2016. And I want to look at the center that did the research. Fairness and accuracy in reporting, which really evaluates news coverage across the board, but advocates for diverse viewpoints in news reporting, really found out that the coverage made this sort of no Dapple warrior persona the focus. And it wasn't about the Lakota and Indigenous water protectors. So it wasn't an issue of protection. It was this warrior imagery, and it was all about the protest. And what that does is it serves to, as we love, a news value is, right, controversy or conflict. It really frames the story as a negative versus a positive, highlighting those oppositional elements instead of the proactive ones, and really getting to why this is an issue on that land for these people, for that community. And so we see that a lot. It's these pipelines are all about, gas prices and natural supply, but stories about the environment and eco-activism are a huge part of what is happening in Indian country. But it's not just about protecting America's resources. It's not about that at all. It's about protecting the resources that those communities have relied on for generations. And it's also about just a different perspective and respect for nature and for the environment. And so it's those things that don't tend to come out in those stories, that it's not about a protest, it is about a protection. And we also don't often hear about the economies that are growing and booming in Indian country until they come up against or in conflict with larger corporate entities that are non-native.
I think one of the biggest disappointments in journalism was the Dapple coverage. There was so many contrasting headlines, especially from the Bismarck Tribune, that really gave an anti-native sentiment. And it was paralleled by just this national focus, because it was also an election year, that, what are people doing and stuff. And I just thought, it was just atrocious, because, from the historical context, there was an article piece from the New York Times that came out about Text Hall, about about the 3 affiliated tribes and the mismanagement of money and everything. But at the same time, for us, we were almost like, it seems like we were distracted enough and mad at the wrong people, because it was a tribe on tribe crime, basically, that a tribe mismanaged its oil, and yet another tribe and everybody that lives south of the Missouri would have to pay for it eventually. And those kind of narratives, that's kind of like taboo, I guess, because tribes really don't want to, like, you know what I mean, get to that perspective of, well, whose fault is it really? Because it's so easy for us to blame, the white people, for our problems and stuff. But at the same time, back in the day, those are the same tactics that were used for tribes to war together before, And so I just thought that was interesting from that perspective because, my family, they're from North Dakota, they're from Fort Yates. They have land, and that's a floodplain down there. So it was really tough at the time, that made it stressful, but it was because of the media and the representation and the identities of it. You're right. It had that warrior persona. It wasn't, there was everybody, it was talking about, the rubber bullets and the horses and and the
Yes.
singers and stuff. And then that fueled everything that we would see, further down the line 5 years later. But I thought that was very interesting, as a journalism blunder, everywhere, everybody was responsible for that, just mayhem that was caused, for those months.
Well, and it does. It's a failure to get to the nuance of where, the historical context of where all of this comes from anyway, right? Which is tribal lands and possession and
Yeah,
dispossession.
there was one tribe that, was lucky that they had a fortune of oil, but what we were understanding and we had the blinders on was that oil has to go somewhere. And so it has to go somewhere. And unfortunately, and I thought was very interesting is that a lot of people weren't talking about it. I think the original plans was to make it north of Bismarck, but they complained about that because of the same problems. That's why it went south. So no one really talked about that perspective too, where they just thought it was easier to go down to go south of Bismarck because that's where the Indians are at, so a very
Yeah.
interesting situation it was, and it was very unfortunate, but that's just the reality of it. We have to deal with our consequences some way or another. And so I thought that was kind of a blunder in my opinion.
Right. We miss the nuance. And then so much of the larger framing is just native as oppositional to progress, which, we saw that throughout the 19th century press, right? Indians were a problem that needed to be dealt with because they were impeding progress. And that's a narrative we continue to see today in coverage around issues that make it into the non-native national media.
So you mentioned about your expectations and some of the beginning challenges. So when you're first starting out, can you kind of expand on other formative challenges that have impacted your career and how have you handled it, minus the expectations and then, the getting going on the field, in beginning, is there anything else that was formative in your career?
Oh gosh, there's so much because journalism is so funny because, yes, you can go get a college degree in journalism and in theory, then you're trained to be a journalist. But, of course, in centuries past, before journalism became, quote, professionalized, there really was very active debate about, is journalism a profession or a trade? And so there's still very much an expectation of learning what you need to know on the job. And that's why those internships are so valuable because you learn things that maybe you've only talked about in a classroom. If we're doing it right, we've talked about those things, but seeing that happen in a newsroom and in the field make all the difference. I think for me, much of it was the difference between telling the story. There's a lot of pressure in a newsroom to get the story, right? You don't want to come back empty-handed because, the producers are not going to be happy. Your news director is not going to be happy. And there were times where I had to choose between what I thought was right in telling the story and in failing to please their expectations of what that story was going to be. And so not so much that they were pushing for me to do things that weren't ethical, but just how they imagined that story was going to play out in the morning and how I found that story happening in the field turned out to be very different things. And I would try to take those opportunities when that happened to tell the story in what I thought was the best way or the right way. And going back to the opening of the casino, they had interviews set up for me before I got there And I was talking to all of the right tribal leadership about the enterprise. But then I went out in the community and found people to talk to about what they thought this was going to do for them. And there were some people who weren't fans of it. And I talked to those people as well. And there was a little bit of, well, I don't know if we should use that interview because it's going to make these other people unhappy. And I said, well, then we're not telling the whole story.
Yeah.
So I think it's that kind of thing. You have to learn to do what you think is right. I mean, journalism is a little bit of a calling. And while we're not supposed to have a bias, I think we all kind of go into it because we have some sense of justice or advocacy about us, for the underdog.
Yeah. Well, they say it's to seek truth and report it. So that's one of our mottos we go by. So
Yeah.
that was a good response.
Yeah, I really appreciate how in your essay you point out that we need to reevaluate the histories we think we know and place natives in the center of their own narrative, because, as you've been talking about, as we've been in this, that, like the news director who had a vision of what you were supposed to look like, right? Or, the news directors you just mentioned right now who are like, well, only imagined natives supporting a casino, not natives, being against that. So can you expand a little bit on that point?
Yeah, it's really, I think it's rethinking our definitions of history, rethinking our definitions a bit of journalism. And it's really, again, putting us in the center of our story. I think it's W. Richard West. He was a founding director for the National Museum of the American Indian. And one thing he said, it's a quote I love. He says, "We hold that it's only when a people can assume authority over their stereotypes that they can truly begin to dispel them." So what does that mean for us to be able to assume authority over those stereotypes? And one reason I actually use this virtual background a lot is these are Indiana, Miami in like the late 20s, early 30s, and they would put on these Miami pageants. And if you can see behind me, many of them are wearing definitely not traditional Miami dress. They're doing the expected headdress, etc., that their audience presumed Indians should look like. But what they were doing in that moment, two very clever things. They were retelling the story of Frances Slocum, who is Mukunsakwa to the Miami. She was a young white girl who married into the Miami tribe after she was taken by the Delaware and lived her life with the Miami. And of course, her story fell prey to those captivity narratives that were so popular in early literature and in the 19th century press. Well, of course, her story was always told as the white rose of the Miamis and the little white girl who was taken. She had an opportunity to return to her non-Miami family and chose not to later in life. But they were retelling her story from the Miami perspective, and they were doing it in this pageant form. But cleverly, those were hard economic times. They would charge admission. And so that was also a way they were able to help people in the nation who were struggling financially during the Depression era. So I love that example. So it's kind of funny that they're almost, they're savvy enough to sort of provide the audience an expected visual representation, but they're also then somewhat taking control of that story and presenting it. So I think that's what we need to consider is how can we give Native communities an opportunity to have that voice and to be engaged. Part of that is the non-traditional source materials, and for historians, it's not overlooking tribal archives and oral histories. Oral histories, particularly Indigenous oral histories, get overlooked or dismissed as not reliable, but those stories have remained consistent for generations. and also to seek out and cite research and writings from Indigenous scholars. And we shouldn't leave history in the past. You know, the problematic representations that we see in the historical press continue to manifest today and in the current moment. And so if we fail to be in dialogue with Native peoples and communities and Native scholars and sources, we're really allowing complicity in the systemic processes that have silenced Native voices in the production of history and in the practice of journalism. The very, I guess, process of the news day and the news cycle give journalists a lot of power to determine who will be heard and seen and who won't. Going back to that example of, if I had not on my own initiated seeking out some of those other interviews, they wouldn't have happened. And then when the reporter comes back, producers then are a gatekeeper to determine which sound bites go forward and which don't. So it's really educating not only how we source our history, but also who we include in the decision-making process of the news cycle and process.
Yeah, so we have a question in the Q&A. And so it's from Julie Mulville, and she says, how or does traditional Indigenous storytelling inform contemporary Indigenous media?
That's a great question. I don't know if I know 100% for sure how. I think culturally, you know, one thing, kind of a new wheelhouse I'm really trying to think through and work in is this idea of what does it mean to be a Native journalist? And you heard me talk about that pigeonholing of Native journalists. And so I don't think we should be pushed into a position where you have to say, you know, or decide, am I a Native who's a journalist, or am I a journalist who's Native? We should be able to support both of those identities in our newsrooms today, because our perspective cannot and should not be separated from that identity. So how we look at stories is going to be a little different. But instead of saying that's not the right way to look at the story, it's to say, well, that brings in a whole new perspective we should be considering when we're telling this story. So I think it's a lot about that. And, you know, it's concerns for me around, there are people who make the case that if it's a Native-centric story, a Native journalist should be covering it, and questions around, can non-Native journalists and entities cover Native issues? But the flip side of that is a Native journalist who works hard and has the same training as any other journalist and works their way into one of these legacy media outlets, be that the Washington Post or NBC, should they then not have the opportunity to just be treated as a journalist covering all stories versus being limited to only being, you know, trotted out when it's convenient? It's a little bit what happened to African-American journalists somewhat when newsrooms realized, oh, we need to have some representation. But then those journalists were only assigned to cover stories in the Black community and that sort of thing. So I think we have to find a balance there.
Yeah, so if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. I wanted to come back to an issue that's has been brought up throughout our discussion, and that's the issue of language, right? And the use of Indian or Native as an umbrella term, right? That doesn't necessarily get to the very different histories and cultures of tribes throughout the country. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. And, you know, I was thinking about one point of clarification when we talk about, you know, the pigeonholing of Native journalists. It's also important to say that many times Native journalists, we feel often, you know, whether we're scholars, whatever our field of expertise, to give back to our community. We want to do that. So that's not to say that many Native journalists choose and want to work in their own communities. The case I'm making is if they're going to seek out Native journalists to work in these other outlets, they need to recognize them as journalists first and then value that particular positioning. But yes, labeling is always an issue in any field and in any endeavor. And again, going back to Native American Journalists Association, they have a resource that really breaks out when and why these terms are there. So Native American, American Indian are very large umbrella terms. The director of NMAI says they still have people who say, when are you going to change your name from American Indian? It doesn't really represent us. So there are moments where a broad term applies, but the absolute best approach is to ask the individual that you're telling whose story you're telling, or the community whose story you're telling, how they want to be referenced. And also for me, important to that is taking the time to learn the pronunciation and learn the spelling, and not being afraid to include that. And then if you need to clarify it for a non-native audience, do that. Oftentimes when I submit research for publication and I'm engaging, well, for example, my dissertation engaged with Miamia history in media. And I would occasionally get reviewers that were like, well, can we take out this Miamia? Because, the newspapers refer to them as the Miami. And so can we not just, and so for me, I'm saying, but that's me identifying my people. And it's important for me, for you to know who we are. Oh, well, can that just go down in the footnote? Or when I put Little Turtle, who's a chief, and I put his Miami name as a reference, it's important for me first for you to know who he is for us. Then I can address who he is for you. And I think journalism needs to do a little bit more of that. A lot of times, I think journalistic coverage defaults to communities that are familiar, that more people know. People know Cherokee because of the Trail of Tears. They think they know Navajo because there's so much coverage around that identity. And they shy away from smaller nations whose names look complicated. And then that's where we go to these default generic terms in that case. And it really is just a matter of the respect you would offer any other source to go to the detailed.
Yeah, definitely, because we're foreign nations essentially, and so we treat the same respect as if the royal family comes from Britain, and so why don't we have that same perspective? But only it's because we're unfamiliar with it. So my last question is so what do you envision your role at KU will be in fostering more Indigenous representation in news and media? And how do you view Lawrence's position to become a destination driver for new and innovative careers in journalism and information?
Sure. Boy, I hope we can do a lot. And I'm extremely fortunate too, because in the journalism school, I have a colleague, Rebecca Schlichting, who's a professor here as well. And we came in together. And so we kind of, hope to be a powerhouse team in Native representation, and just drawing in more. And it's not just about recruiting students. It would be great to have more representation within our student body. What I hope we're able to accomplish, one, is making journalism a more attractive field for Indigenous students. And I think part of that is going to have to be offering them a way to picture themselves doing that. And that's part of what that summer workshop I hope will accomplish. I think it's partnering with groups across campus, our First Nations Student Association, our Native Faculty Staff Council, and those people are really well positioned for us to find and build. I think there needs to be a little of rebuilding in our collaborative efforts with Haskell. There are structures in place, but they seem to be sort of going unused. So I really hope we can revitalize those and build some partnerships. I would love to see us doing more collaboration with student media at Haskell. Jared Nally at the Indian Leader is a phenomenal student journalist. I almost hesitate to put student in front of his name because of the hard lifting and heavy lifting he has done over the last year, covering the Haskell community and what's gone on there. So I think there are a lot of opportunities like that. And I think I'm sitting in a television studio right now, using this as a resource to start to develop some programming to tell those stories. And I think we also have to be open to looking at beyond the campus community and building, relationships perhaps with the nations that call the state we know as Kansas home and the state we know as Missouri home. And I also think there's opportunity. A lot of what we see as coverage of Indian country skews Western geography. We have a ton of stories right here. So I want to start building and branding some of those stories and getting them out there as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's an exciting time to be here in Kansas, just with all the new informative opportunities that are being developed. So if anybody has any other questions, we have about 8 minutes left. So feel free to just put it on the chat or the Q&A. Trying to think on the top of my head. And so you talked about a little bit about that, that Southwest pool. And I think what's kind of interesting is, you are right from a perspective that a lot of news coverage is dominated by that area, and I think it doesn't help that a lot of the news medias think that they need to go to Phoenix, and set up shop and headquarters and stuff, because it's like, well, there's only a few specific tribes. Why is the concentration in one area, when there's equally important stories in Minneapolis, Rapid City, Kansas City, there's natives in Cincinnati, and everything. And so why do you think that is? Is it because, just from the historical context a little bit of why we defer to the Southwest, or what do you think? So, because it's that, but I also understand one area that's very exclusive is the Northwest. And that's and they're really exclusive, with their art opportunities and everything. They only want to support artists in the Northwest. So I just kind of want to figure, why do you think that historical kind of I guess it's that native bias is kind of coming in, and where do you think that stemmed from originally?
Sure. I think there's a lot of things maybe that go into that. And as always, right, when we talk about, and I think that's part of the challenge, honestly, right, is Indian country is not necessarily easy to cover. There are conflicts and there are histories and nuances that are difficult to navigate. And in journalism, right, we're seeking to be balanced and, neutral, objective. So I think some of that stems from a protective stance to sort of mitigate past misrepresentations, past moments where outside forces have tried to break down those unique identities. That's, I think, a little bit where that protectionism comes from. And I think there's also just a very real fear that we have, as communities, have had to sort of demonstrate how we're protecting that identity so that it can't be taken away. And that's in the face of, tribal entities and groups who have been denied that recognition by the United States government. And so there's that sense of protecting that identity that has been granted, which is a very colonial construct. And when it comes to the journalism factor of it, part of that, I think, is ease of opportunity and access to the resources necessary to do a daily journalistic endeavor. It's, the startup costs can be truly an obstacle for native media outlets. And so if you can partner with somebody who's willing to offer that infrastructure and the outlet to get you to air, whatever that air looks like, that's a pretty valuable resource to take advantage of.
Definitely. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no.
We have two more questions that just came
Sure.
in. So the first one is what can those outside of the fields of journalism, academia, and the media field do to support improving Native voices in journalism?
Ooh, wow. That's a huge question. I think whatever your field, whatever your job, you look for the opportunities that you can to offer moments of representation or advocacy. You know, for example, today at my daughter's school, she is doing a presentation for Native American Heritage Month. She's been asked to do a little opening presentation for their end of day school assembly. She, you know, someone had to advocate for that opportunity. So it's if you're a teacher looking for opportunity to give Native students in your classroom a chance to tell their history or share their story or just talk about their family or their community. You know, if you're in business, I think it's looking for opportunities to build, I don't know, events around our Native Heritage Month or Indigenous Peoples Day. You know, I think there's a sense that, you know, it's 1% of the population. It's easy to overlook, but if we took a spreadsheet and sort of looked at all of the opportunities for other marginalized communities and voices, do we see the same opportunities, the same amount of opportunities coming for Native representation? And I'm not sure yet that we do. So it's really seeking out things you can do within your sphere of influence to offer that platform and that opportunity. Yeah. And think about at a restaurant, if we had opportunities to offer more authentic Indigenous foods, how cool that would be.
So, and then we had someone in the chat said, as a KU alum who passed through the J school many years ago, I'm pleased to learn about the new direction. Very interesting and relevant presentation. So that was in the chat. So this last question is from Julie Mulville. So you referenced early on in today's presentation that you and Freddie, which is me, are working on a project together. Can you share more about it? And I feel like you can. So what is that project what is that project that is potentially working on?
Oh, I am completely following your lead. So I am like flying second in command here, if even that. So Freddie has very generously invited me to help him brainstorm for what is, I think we're hoping to be a Good Morning from Indian Country national morning show focused on Indigenous news, stories, weather, about an hour and a half program. We're hoping to launch and start working on in January with maybe a March initial.
Yeah, so there's a March launch date, and we're bringing in Ruben Littlehead Sr., who's a well-known powwow speaker, MC. He's the coach right now for the Baycone basketball men in Muskogee, but he's from Tongue River, Montana, but lives in Lawrence, and that's where his family's at and everything. So I guess the gist around that idea was just to kind of talk about like what this whole conversation was: representation. You know, finally bringing stuff to the forefront and having an inclusive voice that highlights everything, while also providing experiential learning for those that need it the most, which is our students. Because the goal is that we want to set up a pathway where there's people leading those that are training, and then they end up training those that are leaving. And so it's a full circle where, something that's sustainable. But it's also to develop primary jobs too, because, we're trying to make this city attractive, where I'm from. And we're just very fortunate to have those assets of Native American culture here, with you and with everybody else coming to the fold. So that's just a little bit of a preview right there. And I guess we should leave it like that to be more.
Yeah. And training those student journalists to keep their eyes out for those opportunities to tell stories about our Native communities, and not just always going back to the same old dry well sources of stories that we always do.
Definitely. So right now we are right at 1 o'clock. Dr. Mendoza, do you have any last remarks that you want to say for our guest here?
Yes, keep us informed about how this project evolves and where we can find it when it launches.
Definitely. So We would like to extend our sincerest appreciation to Dr. Greene-Blye and those in the audience today for today's big idea discussion titled Natives Making News Towards a More Authentic and Ethical Representation of American Indian Identity, Issues, and Individuals. Please don't forget to mark your calendars down for next month's big idea presentation on December 16th at 12 o'clock, featuring Dr. Clint Blansett, a descendant of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Shawnee and Potawatomi nations, current Langston Hughes Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies and History at the University of Kansas, and Executive Director of the American Indian Digital History Project, as we dive into the importance of cultural preservation, especially focusing in a historic and contemporary context. So my name is Freddy Gipp. I really appreciate everybody coming through and having this very formative discussion with Dr. Melissa Greene-Blye. Dr. Greene-Blye, thank you for taking the time out of your day. I understand it's busy, but I really appreciate you showing up for Humanities Kansas and giving us this really good presentation today. So that's all we have
for
today.
letting me be part of the great work you all do. So
Definitely. So that's all we have, folks, today. I look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.